I'd like to welcome you to the 10th Annual Academic Symposium at Marian University. Our topic this year is freedom of speech versus civility. Where does the one end and the other begin? There are a couple housekeeping items I want to cover first. In terms of sign-in sheets, please sign in if you have not, especially the students who may be signing in because their instructors told them that they needed to sign in, to get credit for being here. There's also evaluation forms to fill out, which we really would appreciate you doing that because we do read those, and they do help us make changes for subsequent symposiums. And speaking of subsequent symposiums, in the comment section, if you have an idea for a topic for next year, as soon as we finish tomorrow, we will start thinking what's going to be our topic next year, and that's the process of the symposium at Marian. We will have time for questions from the audience, and I ask you to please use the microphones because we are taping, and if you're not using the microphones, your question will not be picked up on the tape. I am John Weir, Program Director for Healthcare Administration at Marian University. This year I've also had the pleasure to serve as Chair of the Academic Symposium Committee. And at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Stephen DeSalvo, President of Marian University, to welcome you to Marian. Dr. DeSalvo.
Thank you, and I want to acknowledge the committee that did all the work putting this together, and in particular John for chairing this, so I think he deserves some public recognition. Thank you, John. So as many of you know, this symposium is an annual tradition here at Marian. These topics are picked well in advance. I think it's rather timely that we have this particular topic at this time, given what is going on in the world, and especially in the world of higher education. If you've been following the news, many things surfacing around issues of civility and freedom of speech. I thought it would be important also, as I mentioned over dinner, to remind us that we are a private Catholic institution. We have certain core values. And as we listen to our keynote speaker, I think it would be important for us to keep in mind what those core values are. Community, how we come together as a group, both on this campus and in the greater community. Learning, everything we are about in education involves some aspect of learning. Service, the service we provide here on our campus and within the greater community for the greater good. Social justice, what we do for others, to serve others in the manner of justice and what is right and what is good. And spiritual traditions. And as a Catholic institution, we have traditions, but we also respect all faiths and embrace all faiths in our own traditions. So, I love the sound of babies. It's adorable. So I want you to keep those in mind as we listen to our keynote speaker. I welcome you all here. Thank you for being with us this evening. And in particular, also, I want to thank and acknowledge David Shribman for being here with us tonight. I think you will find his comments to be extraordinary. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeSalvo. This is the first day of our presentations, and Dr. DeSalvo is correct. There's a lot of work that goes into putting on the symposium every year. And the objective of the symposium each year is to identify a significant and controversial topic and provide an opportunity for the university campus and for the Fond du Lac community and surrounding area to discuss, debate, reflect, and learn and understand about this topic. Past symposium discussions have covered topics such as stem cell research, which was our first academic symposium, which was led by Dr. Cheryl Ayala. We've covered global warming, 21st century healthcare, and last year's was an interesting one. Is a university really necessary? We believe, as like Dr. DeSalvo said, that this year's topic is equally significant for discussion. This does not happen without a lot of work by a lot of people. What has gone on today and tonight and tomorrow would not be possible without the effort of our committee members. And at this time, I'd like to call out their names, ask them to stand, and please hold your applause until the end so that they can get recognition for their work on the committee. Dr. Cheryl Ayala, Dr. Michael Ketterhagen, Dr. Aida McCloskey, who cannot be with us tonight, but she's been very active on the committee, Professor Vicki Hildebrandt, Professor Pat O'Connor, Director Mark Heimrell, who is Director of Sponsored Programs, student Andrea Fisher. Okay. She's getting her feet wet as to what the work is necessary for a symposium. Terry Drake, Assistant to the Executive Vice President, and Executive Vice President of Marian University, Dr. Ed Ogle. Thank you. The highlight of the event for the symposium is the keynote speech. And we are fortunate tonight to have Mr. David Shribman with us, who is the Executive Editor and Vice President of Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. As you can see in the brochure, he has experience with the Boston Globe, where he was Assistant Managing Editor, and the Washington Bureau Chief, National Political Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, covered Congress and national politics for the New York Times. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in journalism in 1995, and his column, My Point, is syndicated nationally. Again, we're very fortunate to have Mr. Shribman with us tonight, and I present for you Mr. David Shribman.
Thank you, Mr. Weir, and thank you, President DeSalvo, and thank all of you. I come from the Three Rivers to the One Lake. Delighted to be here. Let me say that there are more members of the Sabres hockey team assembled here since the Adrian game, and I don't want you guys to take this talk about civility too seriously, because I want you to beat the crap out of St. Norbert's next year. I've already broken the rule of civility. I've used language my mother wouldn't approve of. I will say this. I wrote a speech, and I'm going to deliver it. I don't know how long it's going to be, and when I'm done, I'm just going to stop, and then we'll talk. We'll have a conversation, and it'll be far more interesting than what I have to say. But I do want to take a few minutes and talk to you about civility, because it's a topic, I think, that's of the moment. It's a topic of all time, of course, but it's peculiarly important to us today. And I want to just pose this notion. Here's how lacking in civility we are today. We've spent the past several years debating what civility is and why the people we don't like don't have it. Look up the meaning of the word civility, and you'll find that it's rooted in the notion of being part of a city. In our urban age, that should make civility fairly common. But because we know that common sense isn't, we also know that civility isn't exactly overflowing, even in a nation that considers itself, after the book of Matthew, as adapted by John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, as a city upon a hill. So let's first stipulate that politics, as practiced in the United States of America, is largely nonviolent, but seldom confectionary or kind. There was the vicious campaign of 1800. I can see some of you actually may have remembered that. The derision directed at Abraham Lincoln, the slur-filled struggle between James G. Blaine, who was known as the Continental Liar from the state of Maine, and Grover Cleveland in 1884, the bitter battle between Al Gore and George Bush only a dozen years ago, the bitter fighting over the budget and the debt ceiling in our own time just a few months ago. So no doubt the presence of struggle and battle in the last sentence struck you as being completely unremarkable, which helps to prove my point. We're used to martial references in our politics. The word campaign originally meant a military operation. If you read the history of the Civil War, you'll hear about the campaign here and the campaign there. No one was voting in those campaigns. People were dying. U.S. politics ain't beanbag, and the credit for that insight goes to the great Finley Peter Dunn. It ain't kind either. And yet pugilists, and by using the word pugilist, there I go again, as Reagan would say, yet pugilists on both sides prize civility, claim it for their own, deny its presence in their opponents, and salute random acts of it, which in some ways only underlines how rare civility is. For a generation, commentators, including myself, have celebrated the wonderful relationships cultivated by former Speaker Thomas P. O'Neill, Jr. of Massachusetts, first with longtime Minority Leader Bob Michael of nearby Illinois, and then with Ronald Reagan. Now, the mythology is that Tip O'Neill loved to share a lazy afternoon on the golf links with Mr. Michael and then an early evening pop with Reagan. The work hard, play hard narrative is that they fought like animals during the day and relaxed like pals after hours. This used to be normal behavior. Consider the little noticed but very revealing conversation that former Republican Representative Ronald A. Saracen of Connecticut, who was later the president of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, conducted not so long ago with former House Speaker Tom Foley of Washington, a Democrat. This is a Republican and a Democrat having a conversation. And also present was former Congressman Michael of Illinois. This was 7 years ago. What's astonishing to the eyes when you read a transcript of it in 2013 is the prominence of the word friend. In the era of Michael and Foley, the two parties swapped venues for bipartisan leadership meetings, first in the Democrats' office, then in the Republicans. No such meetings occur today, anywhere. Bob Michael said this: when you have this kind of a relationship, it begins at the top. And I think that's what's very necessary in order to filter down to the members so they take a lead from their leaders. Well, if they're getting together and talking socially and being civil to one another, maybe we can too. What a concept. But then again, it was this very familiarity with the Democrats, who had been in the majority for 40 years, that spelled the end of Bob Michael's rule and opened the way to the more combative speakership of Representative Newt Gingrich of Georgia. So in those days, there was the clinking of glasses and staff relationships that have no equal today. Not so long ago, the commentator Chris Matthews, whom I knew as a Tip O'Neill aide, celebrated the speaker-president relationship and quoted Reagan as saying, "The speaker says that here in Washington, we're all friends after 6. I'm not sure that means very much, actually. Being chummy in private, where it doesn't matter, and churlish in public, where it does, is no recipe for civility in public affairs. In truth, let's not forget that the Democrats of that period ran a tyrannical House, where Republican privileges and prerogatives were severely limited. For all the time he spent on the fairways with Speaker O'Neill, Mr. Michael, and under O'Neill and later under Mr. Foley, was always the supplicant, never the political equal, until Bob Michael had a semblance of a working majority because so many conservative Democrats, known as the boll weevils, were voting with the Republicans on tax and budget matters. It's beyond contention that O'Neill and his allies mounted a ferocious offensive against Ronald Reagan in the 1982 midterm congressional elections, portraying the president as the cruel enemy of the aged and an unfeeling plutocrat ready to break faith with the American promise of Social Security. President Reagan's forces returned the attack in kind, focusing on O'Neill's portly profile, his liberal spending record. Lucky for the Speaker, earmarks weren't earmarked for extinction in his time, or else there would be no billion-dollar warren of new tunnels under Boston today. The problem with these civility serenades that we heard in the wake of the tragic shooting of Representative Gabby Giffords and at the ceremonial moments of American civil life, like the State of the Union address and inaugural address, is that they're blatantly political in a way that makes a mockery of civility itself. Still, it's true that inter-party civility might be harder to achieve today than it was in the past. As the boll weevil example suggests, as recently as a quarter century ago, there were large groups of political figures with an affinity for the views of the other party. Some of you students won't realize this, but it was easier for Lyndon Johnson to win the support of his Republican ally in the Senate, Everett Dirksen, than it was for him to win the support of Southern Democrats for civil rights legislation. In fact, a larger percentage of Republican senators than of Democratic senators voted for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Senator Dirksen and Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield had an easier time displaying civility in 1964 than Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell do in 2013. And for all his problems with Republican lawmakers who opposed the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt was far less civil with U.S. Senators Walter George, Ellison, Cotton Ed Smith, and Millard Tydings, who were Democrats he brutally sought to defeat in primaries, I think in 1938. Civility has been a sometime thing. No two figures inspire more partisan controversy than former Senators Robert J. Dole, whose sharp remarks as the Republicans' vice presidential candidate in 1976 still rankle Democrats, and George McGovern, who died not so long ago, whose 1972 Democratic presidential campaign remains a target of Republican bromides today. And yet Senators Dole and McGovern, both from agricultural states, much like Wisconsin, teamed up to support the food stamp legislation and were jointly honored in 2008, only 5 years ago, with the World Food Prize for their efforts to battle hunger among the world's poor. That is civility with a civilizing touch. And when Senator McGovern died not so long ago, I called up Senator Dole, and no one could have been sadder. In fact, I remember what Senator Dole said. He said, "I hurt with him when he hurts." Civility is a noble concept, but sometimes it's confused with mushiness. Barry Goldwater, who was salty but civil, once derided Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, who was the epitome of civility, calling him a dime store New Dealer. In the political life that followed his military career, Eisenhower accepted many of the tenets of the two Democratic presidents who preceded him. That accounted for 20 years, which made it all the easier for his rivals to think him civil. Now, in the past several years, liberals have celebrated conservatives who come over to their side, if only for an issue or two, while conservatives have saluted liberals who wander into their political water from time to time. But there's a difference between civility and complicity. We need not insist on the latter, complicity, in our search for the former, which is civility. So let me pause to ask what I think is the most important question to our topic tonight and maybe in American life. Before we decide in the next couple of months what the optimum level of taxation of capital gains is, whether the age of eligibility for Medicare ought to be raised, how big a tax credit businesses with fewer than 50 employees should get to cover their health care premiums, and whether the mortgage interest deduction should be phased out, and how quickly and at what level, please, we must answer this question. How do political figures adjudicate between conviction and compromise? Let me explain. The phrase, courage of our convictions, tumbles effortlessly off of our lips. And we sure have seen a lot of that these days, courage of our convictions. Lawmakers and other political figures who sign pledges and hew to them, who hold their opinions with fierce determination and view compromise with the same disdain that Margaret Thatcher, who died only yesterday, used to call the wets in her Tory caucus. But let's remember, this is a country whose beloved Constitution was created by a series of compromises, including one that from the start earned the modifier great, the Great Compromise of 1787 that gave us a Senate with 2 members from each state and a House of Representatives whose state delegations are determined by population. Other compromises have been important parts of our history, including the Compromise of 1850, which, flawed as it was, contained 5 elements that put off the Civil War for a decade. One of the signature citizens of the 19th century America, Henry Clay, himself earned the adjective great. He was the great compromiser. He's remembered today as one of the great lawmakers of his time or of any time. Let's pause for a second to consider Profiles in Courage, John Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize winning book of 1956 or 55. Senator Kennedy gave equal honor to both the men of conviction and the men of compromise. In speaking of the lawmakers he selected for this book, he said, "Some demonstrated courage through their unyielding devotion to absolute principle. Others demonstrated courage through their acceptance of compromise, through their advocacy of conciliation, through their willingness to replace conflict with cooperation. Surely their courage was of equal quality, though of a different character." Excuse me here. The principal challenge facing the United States in the second decade of the 21st century, in our time and in yours, is to adjudicate between the two social goods of conviction and compromise. In Profiles in Courage, Senator Kennedy struggled with this issue. He seemed to settle on the notion that political figures should engage in compromises of issues, not of principles. And he argued, we can compromise our political positions, but not ourselves. This is the debate that Senator Kennedy had with himself. It's a debate we must have as a nation. And the first year of a new administration, even a re-elected one, is a very good time to start. Now let's look at an important poll finding. It comes from a Zogby International poll of the nation that shows the better angels of America's nature at work among the public, if not among its politicians. This poll shows that 95% of Americans want civility in politics. 87% of Americans want political disagreement to be respectful. 70% want compromise, even on the most divisive issues. These findings produce what Allegheny College researchers describe as a rule book for politics. The rules are a lot simpler than the infield fly rule and the reserve clause, even the icing rule, for they bar the following common elements of our politics. No belittling or insulting your opponents. No making personal attacks on people with whom you disagree. No shouting over someone during an argument. No interrupting people in public. No manipulating the facts to persuade others to your viewpoint. And no questioning your opponent's patriotism. It's no surprise that the public deplores all these things, even though you can see them in Congress or hear them on your car radio just about every day. Because, as this week's activities here at Marian are designed to show, the truth is that our civic life is no longer civil. We are all drearily familiar with the argument that it was always like this. In the examples I cited a few minutes earlier, I could add to those the lousy comments the Federalists made about the Democrat and Republicans, the insulting bromides about James G. Blaine, as I said, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine, and about Grover Cleveland, "Mama, where's my pa?" going to the White House, ha, ha, ha. That was the illuminating conversation of 1884. Now we ask the question what we ought to do with this. Sessions like these here in Wisconsin are a good start. You can, and I think you should, demand more of your public officials than you do, and you should salute President DeSalvo and others for this conversation you're having here. You can tell your public officials that you demand civility from your children, and you're demanding it from your employees. And by the word employee, I mean your elected political officials. They're your employees. You can do one more thing, and as a newspaper editor, I believe in this firmly. You ought to broaden your own reading, your television watching, and your radio listening. If you're a conservative, please read the editorial page of the New York Times. If you're a liberal, please read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. If you're a liberal, don't just read the New Republic. Read the Weekly Standard. Realize that the people you oppose hold their views with the same sense of authenticity that you have, and that they want and that they want what you want. They want a better country, one that cherishes the rights of individuals and takes succor from the support of community, one that lives in peace but is willing to fight for liberty, one that above all hopes that the next generation, all of you students here, lives a life better and more spiritually richer than the one we enjoy. We should be the change we seek. That phrase comes from that most civil of men, Gandhi. So thanks. So really, I'm much more interested in knowing what you think and what you want to talk about than what I think, because I already knew that. So I want to hear some questions. One back there.
All right, thank you. Earlier in your remarks, you had identified the virtues of men of conviction as well as men of compromise. I have two questions. First, when should a conversation end? And then second, when should arms be used?
When should arms be used?
Yes.
Yeah, let me take them one at a time. When should conversations end? I a few seconds ago urged liberals to read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and liberals should read conservative columnists like George Will. And today, George Will wrote a column about Margaret Thatcher. And his last paragraph, does anybody have a paper that has that column? Maybe not. His last paragraph said that Mrs. Thatcher knew that issues were never finished. And so some fights don't ever end. Senator Kennedy said this brilliantly in 1980 at the Democratic National Convention after he lost to President Carter, and he said, "The dream goes on, the fight shall never end." It's the greatest Ted Kennedy line of all time. But I think some fights have got to end. Eventually, we have to stop fighting about Obamacare. Eventually, we have stopped fighting about whether we can elect a black man president. We're about to stop fighting about whether people of the same sex can marry. We no longer fight about whether Jews can belong to city clubs and social clubs. At some point, there's a natural rhythm when we should stop fighting. And I don't know when that is, and I don't think there are any rules, and even political scientists here at Marian and elsewhere probably can't come up with a formula. But there is a time to say this fight is over. You all know, and I think it may have been in Wisconsin or in Minnesota, where Chief Joseph said, "I will fight no more forever." And there are some times when you should cease fighting. I don't know when that is. When to take up arms? I'm kind of against arms in Congress. Although there have been celebrated attacks in Congress. There was a congressman from Vermont shortly after Vermont joined the Union in 1790 who was known as the Spitting Lion. He was Matthew Lyon. He liked to spit in the faces of his adversaries. And there was I think it was in 1849 or 1850, a senator from my own state, Charles Sumner, was beaten with a cane on the floor of the Senate and couldn't return for 5 or 6 years. Those generally are not particularly good moments in American history. And so I don't know whether your question means when does a country go to war, or when do you fight for a principle, in the streets. I'm not going to advocate violence as people of my own generation, maybe of yours, did in the 60s, to create social change. If the question about when do you go to arms is a question of nations and going to war, that's a very sober and serious question that Americans have pondered since 1789 when they gave the right to declare war to the Congress, not to the President. Now, we have seen since 1950, we've had no declared wars since 1950, and yet we have fought in Korea, in Vietnam, in Panama, in Grenada, in Iraq, and in Iran, and covertly in Central America. So that's a very complicated question. As you can see, I'm filibustering because I don't really have an answer. Filibuster, by the way, is also a military term. Yeah, so campaign, filibuster, all these pugilists, these are all military words that we use in our politics. Should tell us a little bit about the kind of civility we don't have.
I have a question on social media. It's become increasingly difficult for the media to get its information out, I'll say, because the media environment is fractured with the rise of social media. When I was younger, it was very common to read a paper every day for breakfast, and now very few people get the paper. The paper has gotten to be less content, so it means we don't get it anymore.
I haven't noticed that at all. How can you say that?
So I'm curious as to what
call the office and see if that's true for us. Go ahead.
So I'm curious what your thinking is on the role of social media and how that plays into the debate on civility as the market fractures into smaller and smaller groups.
I would say the most astonishing thing of that question is that it was the second, not the first question. I think that all new forms of media are vulnerable to the charge that they decrease civility or attack civility. The committees of correspondence in 1773, 4, and 5, that was the new media of the time. Those were blogs written by guys in wigs and distributed by guys on horseback. And they were extremely incendiary and upsetting to the establishment. And then you had, the penny press, which was full of lies, and the notion of you give me the pictures and I'll give you the war, in which a newspaper editor basically invented the Spanish-American War of 1898. Then you have radio, and then you had people like Father Coughlin of Michigan, the radio priests and ministers who sowed hatred on the radio. And then you had television, and then all this other stuff. So, I mean, we're used to cascades of new media, and not the new kind of new media we're talking about here, but new forms of media changing the conversation. Now, what worries me about the current set of new media is two things. One is I still have, 1, 2, 5 to 7, and 2. I still have 9 years of tuition to pay for. And I'm a newspaper editor, so I'm worried sick. That's my first level of worry. But my real worry is that we don't have any common shared experiences anymore. And that that's one part of it. And the other part of it is that we can hide behind anonymity, and that these new forms of media arm us with new forms of cruelty. Let me take the first one first. Shared experiences. In 1963, more than half of Americans watched the Beverly Hillbillies. Of course, the people of my age, it's stunning that only half did, but nonetheless. More than half. I was saying this at dinner. In 2013, not one television series will get even 10% of Americans watching it. Now, not that the Beverly Hillbillies was such a culturally uplifting experience with Jed and Jethro and that moronic blonde, what was her name? I forget. Ellie Mae and Miss Douglas, what was her name? Mr. Douglas and Miss whatever. This is one of the most stupid shows, most stupid production products of Western civilization ever. So I'm not really talking about the Beverly Hillbillies. I'm talking really about November 22nd, 1963, which people of a certain age know exactly what that means, and if you don't, it's the day that President Kennedy was killed. Everybody watched television at that moment. It was the first really universally shared experience in American life, with the exception of 2001. We don't have many shared experiences. In fact, our only shared experiences right now are sports events. Last night between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock, national basketball championship games. Next year, when you guys are in the Division III Frozen Four, we'll be all watching that. But sports and tragedies are our only shared experiences right now, and that's a dangerous thing. And I think you have the atomization of civilization through social media, and there's some terrific things about social media, and I can talk for hours about that. But you asked about the danger, and I think the danger is that we fracture our sense of community, that we only talk to people who agree with each other, and I spoke about that in the prepared remarks a little bit, and that we abandon our sense of civility. And there was some conversation at dinner tonight about a Facebook page that I think you're all all too intimately aware of, in which you can diss your fellow students and complain about them without identifying yourself. And you have I think we have armed each other and ourselves with the power to hurt and to bully, and I think we need some self-regulation of that. I'm against government regulation of any sort involving freedom of expression. I'm a First Amendment absolutist, and President DeSalvo, I will note that the First Amendment isn't only about the freedom of the press, but it's about the freedom of religion also. So I'm a First Amendment absolutist, and I welcome you as I suspect you are as one. So we don't want to regulate conversation. We just think we all ought to regulate it ourselves. Yes, sir. You can just shout it, and I'll repeat it. Oh, he reads the newspaper.
Are including their opinion in where they're supposed to be reporting the news by their choice of words, subtle innuendos. They seem to put in the reporting of news their opinion. In fact, there was a comment made that in the AP earlier we had noticed that AP is changing some of their terminology to become more politically correct. But the comment was that, and I quote, "Even in death, conservatives can't get an even break, especially from the Associated Press. A writer by the name of J.P. Fryer caught the supposedly neutral news service bashing the late Margaret Thatcher in her obituary while lionizing socialist nutball Hugo Chavez." The point I'm trying to make is that those of us who do read the newspaper, and we find that the writers are intercalating their opinion when they're supposed to be reporting facts. The opinion on the editorial page is one thing, but I'm noticing that more and more, and I am convinced that the newspapers can and do influence opinion.
Well, let me take this one by one. I deplore opinion in news columns. I also don't think that Hugo Chavez should be called a nutcase or whatever he was. I mean, I think he might be kind of on the nutty fringe, but I would never allow that in the newspaper. And to disparage Margaret Thatcher, there's been, I'll talk about the Thatcher thing for just a moment, but I'll address fully your comments in a moment. Margaret Thatcher, I was struck by the two streams of commentary on Mrs. Thatcher. One was how that she was a great leader, surely probably one of the two greatest leaders of Great Britain in the 20th century and one of the 5 or 6 of all time. And I think that's a legitimate assertion, and I think that belongs in a news story. I also think that there's been another strain of commentary about Mrs. Thatcher in which that she shattered the sense of British community not in prosecuting, but at least in encouraging, some strong efforts against unions and working people and this kind of thing. Those are both legitimate viewpoints, and they probably should be reflected in obituaries. But generally speaking, opinion has no place in the news columns. In my own newspaper, my predecessor had control of the editorial page and of the news pages. When I came to take my current job, I relinquished control of the opinion pages because I don't believe that editors should have opinions. As a result, I don't vote in primaries. I'm not a member of any party. I don't read our editorials because I don't want to be infected by them. I respect our editorial writers and like them actually very, very much, but I don't read their work. I discourage our reporters from any political activity of any sort. I don't allow them to march in abortion rallies one way or the other. I don't allow them to put bumper stickers on their cars or signs on their homes, or to wear wear buttons from one side or another. I think our salvation, if we are to have one, depends upon just the very notion that you've been expressing, which is that we ought not to have opinions in the newspaper. Ordinarily in events like this, and I do a lot of these, people ask, well, isn't it true that newspapers are liberal? Well, I don't know. I think it's the wrong question. I think there are two points worth making about that. I think that news reporters are biased, but they're not biased in the way you think. They're biased toward change. We require change for us to have something in the paper tomorrow. If the world were completely the same tomorrow as it is today, we would have nothing but Dear Abby and the comics to write about. So we have a bias toward change. I would also add that as a news executive, I have a bias toward change occurring before 6 o'clock so we can get it in the paper and not pay overtime. And we have a bias toward change, and that we are not liberal in the following way. If you take the traditional definition of liberals and conservatives, liberals being people who are congenial to social change and conservatives people who are resistant to social change, I want you to come to my newsroom when we try to change anything. They're the most conservative people on earth. So every time I hear about how liberal the news media is, I think of what their reaction when I want to change where they sit, or their desks, or what time the deadline is, or anything like this. This is the biggest group of conservatives you've ever seen. So the important thing about news reporting is not whether the person who does it is liberal or conservative. The important thing about news reporting is whether the person who does it is professional or not. Now, I've tried not to have any opinions. My wife has lots of opinions. And she's right about everything. But, proven right. But I try not to have opinions. It's my professional duty to present a news report that is deloused or cleansed of bias. So I think it is possible for someone who is devoutly against abortion to cover a so-called pro-choice rally. I think that's possible. I think it's possible for somebody whose views are conservative to write fairly about liberal politicians. Because I think people of my trade, of my craft, are more devoted to professionalism than they are to ideology. I know it's the case in my case. In the course of my career, and I covered 6 presidential elections, and I try not to fall in love. But the people I had the best relationships were the following people: Robert Dole, Michael Dukakis, Jack Kemp, George McGovern. Now, I'm either a schizophrenic or a professional. And so I think professionalism is the question and not ideology. I try to hire people whose strongest impulse is professionalism, and I try to nurture that value in them. It's our professional duty to write and present the news without fear or favor and without ideological tinge. And so, I mean, I covered abortion for 2 years for the Wall Street Journal without being able to decide myself whether it was a woman's right or a sin. And I tried not to decide, and I didn't. Now, you may lose respect for me for that, but the fact is, my job wasn't to decide whether it was right or wrong. My job was to present the news fairly. And I think that's the overriding concept. And I know that my colleagues at the Post-Gazette and my former colleagues at the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, I mean, I could work for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. It was no transition for me. And people go from those papers one to the other all the time. I know people who work for the Wall Street Journal who are married to people who work at the Washington Post. It's not a problem. Those aren't intermarriages. It's professionalism uber alles. Yeah, just shout the question. I'll just
Yeah, I've got a microphone.
Okay.
Some of the civil discourse that we have in the congressional level has been attributed to gerrymandering, and
First of all,
also
let me stop. I don't mean to be rude, but I'm from the North Shore, and his name was Eldridge Gerry, Gerry, and the word is not gerrymandering; it's gerrymandering.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Gerryman, thank you.
I'm from his hometown.
Okay. That and campaign finance laws, where the members of Congress have to spend so much time raising money versus being in Congress compromising. Do you want to comment on the effects?
In other words, they're spending their time compromising with donors rather than with other lawmakers.
Right. Could you comment on the effect of that on the civil discourse in the nation? And I realize you might want to not offer any opinions as to how things could change, but...
Okay, well, first of all, gerrymandering is, Eldridge Gerry grew up in Marblehead, Massachusetts. He was the commander of naval operations during the Revolutionary War. Gerrymandering has been part of our political system from the very start. Now it's a little more complicated now because with computers you can actually gerrymander. I know a guy who gerrymandered his ex-wife out of his district. The line went like this. So her house, he knew he wasn't getting her vote, right? Her house was not in his district. Okay? You can do this. So it's more sophisticated now. So, I mean, gerrymandering is a political gamble. I mean, Republicans, now this goes against all of your instincts, but Republicans were the biggest advocates at one time of putting blacks together so they could elect a black member of Congress. Do you know why? Because by concentrating blacks in one district, they assured the election of a black Democrat, but they removed all of those black Democratic votes from the 2 or 3 other adjacent districts, thereby losing one district, but assuring their victory in 2 or 3. So gerrymandering is a dangerous game. As for raising money, I only wish they spent that money in newspaper advertising. Raising money, I think it's a tough thing. It's a distraction. It tends to put you exposure. I think you're getting at something without knowing it. It tends to put you in front of people who have one view or another, and tends not to puts you in front of people who agree with you or are more extreme in the views you hold, rather than to a broader spectrum of society. So I think that's almost a bigger danger than the time they spent. These clowns could legislate in 3 days, or in 2 90-day sessions, the way they did before. I don't think it's the time they spend, although they moan about it all day. It's the exposure to people who reinforce certain views and who diminish the notion of compromise. Getting back to that. So I think those are both interesting things, but I still think civility requires the courage to behave the way your mother taught you to behave. What's so hard about that? Yeah.
I also am a member of the press. I've been a columnist for 27 years for the Gannett News Service.
So let me just say, would you agree with me that being a columnist is like being married to a nymphomaniac? You do it, and then you have to do it again.
No, I enjoy being a columnist, and I've all right.
I'll say no more.
All right, I got you. All right, but the question I have is, over those 27 years, what I have seen is not only the diminishing of the staff in the newsroom. I mean, they've cut them right and left. Also,
at least
the
they
newspapers.
cut them right and left, just to make the point. But go ahead.
Also, the newspapers have become thinner and thinner, and fewer people seem to be sitting down to read their news in the newspaper.
Oh, I'm waiting for the good news here. Go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
The thing that a lot of people are turning to the newspaper for are the columns. They seem to feel that if they have individual columnists that they're reading, it has a more personal note. After all, you can turn on TV 24 hours a day and you can get news ad infinitum. But as far as the columns, those are unique. And I think a lot of people read the newspaper precisely because they're interested in the columns.
Oh, I agree with you. And, of course, I have a personal stake in this.
So do I.
Yeah, I know you do. How have you done this? I'm on year 21. How'd you get to 27?
I'm not sure. I'm the longest-running columnist at the Fond du Lac Reporter in the history of the newspaper.
Oh,
I
really?
have no idea why, but I ain't
First of all,
looking
a
a gift
moment
for
of congratulations for her. Really.
I'm not looking a gift horse in the mouth.
Let me say on your behalf, how many times a week do you write? Once?
I write once.
Well, I write once. So that requires her to have 156 ideas a year. 102 lousy ones, 104 lousy ones, and 52 acceptable ones, right? That's about right. You know how hard it is to have 156 ideas a year? It's darn hard. And so I salute you, and it's great. I haven't missed a week in more than 1,000 consecutive weeks either, and I had open heart surgery, so I salute you. It's really hard work, but you're right. Columns give personality to a newspaper. No sports section is complete without a decent columnist, moaning or complaining about how horrible whatever the team is. They add personality to a newspaper, and they're indispensable. You're right about something else, that most news is a commodity. It doesn't really matter, despite what a few of you might suggest, whether you find out that Mrs. Thatcher died from the New York Times or from the Washington Post or from Gannett News Service or McClatchy or the Los Angeles Times. The important thing is that Mrs. Thatcher died. But we have seen, actually, in the last 24 hours, a flowering of commentary of much different flavor about Mrs. Thatcher, and that's really been a really interesting thing. I've been reading a lot of it in the British press and in our own press. The New York Times editorial page today had vastly conflicting views about Mrs. Thatcher. So, as far as I'm concerned, viva le columnist, and may you write forever. And actually, it occurred to me the other day that you and I ought to be really for Obamacare, because it's going to keep alive all these old people who read papers.
Your speech focused on elected leaders, and I appreciate that, but I'm also concerned with civility as citizens, and your example of covering the abortion debate is a good one. I really feel that's a good example of an issue that we like to scream at each other rather than having civil discussions.
Let me interrupt. And for all the screaming we've done on that issue since 1974, do you think that public opinion polls have moved more than 1 percentage point either way? No. Not one bit. We might as well stop screaming, but I apologize
that's
for
my
interrupting.
point. Do you think there's any hope for citizens engaging in more civil debates about what are divisive, strongly felt issues like that?
Well, take a look at how many people are here tonight. I would guess there's a couple hundred people here. And, maybe Fond du Lac is that kind of town where it's so dull you got to hear the guy from Pittsburgh talk. But maybe you guys really care about civility. And I've spoken at other, and I'm not on some kind of civility chautauqua here. But I have spoken several times about this issue, and I always get good crowds for it. And so I think there is a hunger for it, and I think in our society, the markets respond. You remember in 1930, no, you wouldn't, but some of you would, in 1938, after the 38 election, or after the in 1937, the President Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court, and he failed to do so. That was the year in which a switch in time saved 9. But we also learned that the Supreme Court follows the election results, and so do politicians. And politicians, I think, eventually will respond. But here's the danger. Here is the danger. You talked about gerrymandering. Who's your congressman here? And is he Republican? I used to cover Congress, but I'm Republican. Okay. And did this district go for for Romney or for Obama? It did. Okay, so ruined my argument. But Republican lawmakers tend This is Clement Zablocki's area, isn't it? No? That's south? Okay. Was Mel Laird from here? Okay. Anyhow, Republican lawmakers tend to be elected from districts that went for Romney. And in those districts, there is little pressure on them to move to the center. In fact, if they move to the center, they're vulnerable from primaries from the right. And the danger here is that districts have been gerrymandered, as you suggested, in a way so that we get extremists for lawmakers. Now, extremist is a loaded word, and I want to kind of deload it a little bit, but people who tend to be pretty fervent in their own views dramatically on one side or the other of our politics. And I think that's a huge danger. And if you're in a district that went for Romney and you're a Republican, you're not going to have, there is no impetus for you. There is no value for you in coming to a budget agreement with the president. If you're a Democrat in a district that went for Obama, there is no payoff for you to listen to the Republicans. And that's the danger of gerrymandering. But I think you have voted with your feet tonight, to come out and talk about civility. And I think that politicians notice that. Eventually, they'll get it.
My question, right up here, my question is about freedom of speech versus civility as it applies to what earlier were letters to the editor to a newspaper. Back in the old days, it seems space limitations by themselves would take care of that. You would have some selection as to what you would print in the newspaper. Yeah. Now, seemingly, radio stations, newspapers, they're all on websites, and they have that challenge of sorting out the freedom of speech versus what they're going to allow to be on their website. So how do you see that evolving, that battle?
I don't know what your paper in Fond du Lac does, but we moderate our comments. Do you have comments? Right, well, we moderate them in which an editor goes through them, and if they're uncivil, if they're unkind, if they're defamatory, we remove them. Now, people say, well, that's censorship. That's not censorship. Censorship is the government telling you what you can say and think. We are private companies that have the right to edit. There's a difference between censorship and editing. You have a constitutional right to think that your neighbor is well, I can't use that word here, but is one of those. But you don't have a constitutional right to have that posted in the Post-Gazette. And so we remove comments that are personally injurious, that could be libelous, because if you have something on your website that's libelous, then we also run the risk of being sued for libel. So we're very, very careful about this. So some of these conversations get out of hand, and we don't allow commenting on certain kinds of issues that we know will be incendiary. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure it did. Do you have a question?
Doesn't that lead why your comment about the private corporations deciding what it is that can go in the paper and not paper opinion and things like that? That pretty much is the fear of people who are afraid of a Murdoch controlling large groups of newspapers or even multimedia. And therefore what you have, especially if they're locked into certain other constituencies or thought patterns, that locks in the non-compromise pattern again, because they're going to try to push their perspective.
Well, first of all, Murdoch doesn't own all that much in the United States yet. He may buy the Tribune Company.
He wants to buy L.A. too.
Right. Well, they own the Tribune Company. The Tribune Company owns them.
Yeah.
My paper is owned by a family that's impervious to political influence. I know this. I mean, I've never been pushed one way or the other ideologically by them. The danger of American newspapers has always been that they're edited by Babbitts. This, you know, this you all
What
know.
does that mean?
Lewis and Babbitts. That they're edited by Babbitts rather than by revolutionaries on either side. So I don't worry about corporate ownership of newspapers for that reason. I worry about corporate ownership of newspapers because they actually care a lot about making a profit. And as we've illustrated so vividly here this evening, that isn't so easy anymore. And so I'm much more interested, much more worried about the profit motive or the desire to break even, or the need to break even economically than I am about any kind of ideological rigidity. Now, I recognize that newspaper companies cannot lose money, and we'd love to make money, actually, but we haven't done so at our paper for years, and I hope we will soon. And I'm devoutly committed to making money because I don't think this family should subsidize other families forever. But I think the big danger is our fear, our economic fear, and our lack of self-confidence that results from it. You want to?
Yeah, a follow-up. What about the idea of the fourth estate? And that there needs to be some sort of check on some of the corporate structures, and now corporate structure is very closely tied because of the United Citizens United.
Let's define corporate broadly, not necessarily companies, but certain established ways of thinking, and commitment to certain forms of government or whatever. And I'm completely with you on this. I think that we need to be free from all that kind of rigidity, and time and time again we have proved that it's necessary to do so. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel has won 3 Pulitzer Prizes in the last 4 or 5 years because of its courageous reporting. We do some very courageous reporting that's much against our economic interest in Pittsburgh. I can assure you of that. That Watergate would not have occurred, would not have been known had it not been for the vigilance of the press. I can go through scandal after scandal, Iran-Contra, the Teapot Dome, the Belknap scandals in the Grant administration. It can go on and on. And so it's an indispensable part of our culture to have a watchdog press, and that this is one of the signal differences of our society, that we have set up in our society a parallel power structure, a fourth estate. The phrase actually comes from the French. But we have done so here, and we have armed it with special rights. We've given it, and you'll agree, limited social approbation, and we pay its practitioners reasonably well, and we tell them to go criticize the power structure. It's a remarkable thing, and it's something we should cherish, which is why I want you all to go buy a newspaper tomorrow. I can go all night if you can.
Are there any other questions?
Well, thank you very much. May I just add one thing? If you're interested in civility, you've done a very important thing this evening, and through tonight and through tomorrow, is that you voted with your feet to show an interest and a commitment to this, even if your teacher and your coach told you had to come. But no coach or teacher told many of you that you had to come. So I want to thank you, actually, for your commitment to this. I want to thank my colleague, columnizing colleague, salute her. Salute all of you who buy a newspaper or read our websites, to remind you that people who produce those things need to be paid, and that's why we are all going to be charging you for reading our websites. So get used to it and ante up, because I've got 9 more years of tuition to pay for.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that finishes Tuesday's activities. We thank you very much for coming and voting with your feet. We hope you will vote tomorrow, and you will vote for subsequent academic symposiums at Marian University. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the evening.